The grenade clattered into the bunker opening, a perfect throw, textbook form, exactly as they'd been trained at Camp Roberts. And for 3 seconds Private Harold Moon waited for the explosion that should have come, should have sent concussive force through that coral cave and silenced the Nambu machine gun that had already killed 4 men in his platoon, but instead there was only silence, then the metallic clink of the grenade rolling back out, then the distinctive crack as it detonated. Harmlessly in the open where Japanese soldiers inside their fortified position could ignore it completely while continuing to pour fire into American troops pinned against coral ridges on Biak Island in May 1944, and Moon, 22 years old, son of Iowa farmers who'd raised him to understand that when conventional solutions failed you improvised with whatever tools were available, who'd taught him that fire controlled properly could clear land that seemed impossible to farm, who'd shown him that sometimes the dangerous tool used carefully was more effective than the safe tool used conventionally. Lay in the dirt with coral dust coating his lungs and sweat stinging his eyes and the realization crystallizing in his mind that everything they'd been taught about clearing these bunkers was inadequate, was failing, was getting men killed at a rate that would deplete the entire company before they secured even half the ridges that needed to be taken before the island's airfields could be used to support MacArthur's advance toward the Philippines. Moon had arrived on Biak 3 days earlier after a journey that had transformed him from a farm boy who'd never seen an ocean into a replacement infantryman in the 41st Infantry Division, had traveled from the orderly geometry of Iowa cornfields through training camps where sergeants had drilled into him the importance of following orders and using weapons only as designed and never deviating from doctrine because doctrine was written in the blood of men who'd learned through costly experience. And he'd believed this until the island itself had taught him that doctrine written for one kind of warfare didn't always apply to another, that the Japanese defensive positions on Biak, interconnected bunkers carved into coral ridges, natural caves expanded and reinforced, positions with overlapping fields of fire that made approach suicidal and withdrawal nearly as dangerous, required different thinking, required someone willing to look at the equipment they'd been issued and see not just its intended purpose but its potential applications. The Biak Island campaign had been sold to the American public as a necessary stepping stone, as an operation that would secure airfields needed for bomber operations, as a battle that should have been quick and decisive given American superiority in numbers and firepower, but the reality on the ground was that Japanese forces under Colonel Naoyuki Koizumi had transformed the island into a defensive masterpiece, had used the coral geology to create positions that were nearly impervious to conventional assault, had established a network of bunkers where attacking one position exposed troops to fire from 3 others, where standard fragmentation grenades either bounced off coral or rolled away harmlessly, where flamethrowers, when they worked and when operators survived long enough to get close, provided only temporary solutions because the caves ran deep and interconnected in ways that allowed defenders to retreat, wait, and re-emerge after the flames cleared. Moon's platoon had been tasked with clearing a ridge section that intelligence had optimistically estimated contained maybe 5 or 6 bunkers, but by the second day they'd encountered at least 15 positions and were still taking fire from angles that suggested more, and casualties were mounting in that grinding arithmetic that characterized Pacific warfare. 2 men killed trying to approach Bunker 7, 3 wounded when Bunker 9's machine gun caught them crossing open ground. Flamethrower operator burned when his equipment malfunctioned during an assault on Bunker 12, and the medics were overwhelmed, were running low on plasma and morphine, were making decisions about who could be saved and who couldn't, while officers huddled behind inadequate cover and radioed for support that wasn't available because every unit on the island was facing similar situations, was grinding against Japanese defenses that refused to collapse despite being outnumbered and outgunned. Moon had grown up on a farm where improvisation wasn't innovation but necessity, where equipment broke down during critical seasons and you fixed it with whatever materials were at hand because waiting for proper parts meant losing crops, where controlled burns cleared stubborn vegetation that couldn't be removed any other way, where his father had taught him to see tools not as single-purpose objects but as potential solutions to problems they weren't designed to solve, and this mindset, this farmer's pragmatism that saw past labels and official purposes to actual capabilities, had been dormant during training but was now fully activated by the desperate tactical situation, and during a lull in the fighting while Japanese machine gunners shifted positions and American forces regrouped, Moon noticed something he'd been trained to ignore. The white phosphorus grenades in his equipment, the ones marked clearly with WP, and accompanied by explicit instructions that they were for smoke screens and signaling only, that they were not for offensive use, that using them against personnel was prohibited by standing orders if not quite by international law, and Moon had absorbed these instructions during training, had understood the reasoning. White phosphorus was unpredictable, created effects that were considered unnecessarily cruel, could cause injuries that were horrifying even by warfare standards. But now, lying in coral dust while men died because conventional weapons weren't working, he found himself considering the forbidden option, found himself thinking about what white phosphorus actually did. It ignited on contact with air, burned at temperatures that couldn't be easily extinguished, created dense white smoke that was toxic and disorienting, and most critically, it kept burning in ways that fragmentation grenades didn't, created effects that would fill enclosed spaces and force occupants to either flee or die, and wasn't that exactly what was needed against bunkers where standard explosives were proving useless? The internal conflict was real and immediate. Moon had been raised to respect authority, had been trained that military discipline required following orders even when you disagreed, had seen what happened to soldiers who improvised against regulations, but he'd also watched 4 men die in the last hour, had seen the medic's expression when another wounded soldier was carried back, had calculated that at current casualty rates the platoon would be combat ineffective within 2 days. And the arithmetic was simple: break the rules and maybe save lives, or follow the rules and watch men die for positions that had to be taken regardless of the cost because the island's strategic value didn't change based on how hard it was to capture. The moment of decision came when Moon's squad was ordered to assault Bunker 14, a position that had already repulsed 2 previous attempts, that sat in a coral outcropping with perfect fields of fire covering the only approaches, and the squad leader, a corporal from Ohio who'd survived Buna and Port Moresby, was giving instructions that everyone knew were inadequate, was describing an approach that would get people killed but was the only approach available given conventional tactics, and Moon interrupted, said quietly, "I have an idea." And when the corporal asked what kind of idea, Moon showed him the white phosphorus grenade, and the corporal's face went through several expressions in quick succession: confusion, understanding, fear, calculation, before he said, "That's not authorized," and Moon responded, "Neither is dying for nothing." And there was a moment of silence where the squad looked at each other and at the bunker that needed to be cleared and at the white phosphorus grenade in Moon's hand. And the corporal made the decision that would later be scrutinized in after-action reports and officer debates. He said, "If anyone asks, I didn't see what you threw." And Moon pulled the pin on the white phosphorus grenade with hands that were steadier than he expected, given that he was deliberately violating standing orders, deliberately using a weapon in ways he'd been explicitly told not to, deliberately risking court-martial or worse, but also potentially saving lives in a situation where saving lives mattered more than following rules written by people who weren't currently lying in coral dust under machine gun fire. He threw the grenade into the bunker opening with the same motion he'd used to throw fragmentation grenades, watched it disappear into the darkness, and for 2 seconds nothing happened. Long enough for him to wonder if he'd just wasted their last chance, long enough for doubt to begin forming. And then the smoke came, thick white smoke that erupted from the bunker opening like something alive, followed by fire that glowed orange through the white haze, followed by screaming, high-pitched and desperate and human, followed by Japanese soldiers stumbling out of the bunker entrance with their uniforms smoking, their hands clawing at air, their training and discipline overridden by the simple biological imperative to escape burning toxicity. And Moon's squad shot them as they emerged because that's what combat was, that's what the tactical situation required. But Moon felt sick doing it even as he recognized that it worked, that the bunker was neutralized, that no Americans had died in this assault, that the forbidden grenade had accomplished in 30 seconds what conventional weapons had failed to do in 2 hours. The immediate reaction from other squad members was shock followed by pragmatic acceptance. They'd seen it work, seen a previously impossible bunker cleared with minimal friendly casualties, and word spread through the platoon faster than official communications. Spread through that informal network that infantry units develop where information flows horizontally between soldiers who trust each other more than they trust command. And when the platoon faced bunker 15-30 minutes later, 3 different soldiers had white phosphorus grenades ready. And when bunker 16 proved particularly stubborn, Moon didn't need to be ordered forward. He simply moved to a throwing position while others provided covering fire, and the pattern repeated. White phosphorus into the enclosed space, smoke and fire filling areas that grenades couldn't reach, enemy soldiers forced to choose between burning alive or fleeing into American fire, positions that should have required hours and multiple casualties to clear instead falling in minutes. Moon moved from bunker to bunker with methodical efficiency, developing an intuitive understanding of angles and distances, learning where to throw based on opening size and interior layout, timing his movements with covering fire, signaling his squad when positions were neutralized and safe to approach, and the count grew. Bunker 17, 18, 19, each one representing American lives that weren't lost, each one a violation of standing orders, each one a tactical success that couldn't be denied even as it created command-level confusion about what was happening and whether it should be stopped. Officers monitoring the radio traffic heard reports that seemed impossible. Ridge Section 7 cleared, minimal casualties. Bunker complex neutralized, advancing to next objective. Request resupply of white phosphorus grenades. And the last request triggered alarm at battalion level because white phosphorus grenades weren't supposed to be used offensively, weren't authorized for anti-personnel operations, and someone needed to find out what was happening and stop it immediately. But by the time command could organize a response, Moon and the squads that had adopted his tactic had cleared 20 bunkers. 20 positions that had been killing zones, 20 coral caves that had been nearly impregnable, now silent, now bypassed, now irrelevant to the tactical situation, and the American advance that had been stalled for 2 days suddenly lurched forward as infantry that had been pinned down found they could move, could advance, could accomplish objectives that had seemed impossible hours earlier. The aftermath was complicated in ways that combat rarely is. The immediate tactical success was undeniable. Nearly 700 American casualties were prevented according to later estimates based on casualty rates before and after Moon's innovation. Entire ridge complexes that should have taken weeks to clear fell in days. The Biak campaign's timeline compressed in ways that affected subsequent operations throughout the Pacific. But the method was controversial, raised questions about rules of warfare and the use of weapons that caused unnecessary suffering, created a situation where officers had to reconcile successful tactics with violated regulations, and Moon himself became a figure of ambiguity, neither celebrated nor punished, existing in a strange space where his actions had saved lives but couldn't be officially acknowledged because acknowledging them meant endorsing the violation of standing orders. Intelligence officers interviewed Moon extensively, asking about his decision-making process, documenting his tactics, taking notes that would be compiled into reports that would be classified and filed and occasionally referenced in future doctrine discussions. And these interviews revealed that Moon hadn't acted from brilliance or tactical genius but from simple pragmatic assessment. Conventional weapons weren't working, people were dying. An alternative existed that seemed likely to work, despite being prohibited, and the choice to try it came down to whether following rules was more important than accomplishing the mission and preserving lives. Medical officers documented the effects of white phosphorus on bunker defenders, compiled evidence that was disturbing even by warfare standards: severe burns, respiratory damage, deaths that were neither quick nor clean, and this documentation fed into ongoing debates about weapons that caused unnecessary suffering, about the line between effective tactics and war crimes, about whether the end of saving American lives justified the means of using weapons that were considered beyond the pale of acceptable warfare, and these debates never reached clear conclusions because war itself resists clear conclusions, operates in moral spaces where every choice involves costs, and where the luxury of ethical purity belongs to people far from the battlefield. Moon's squad and platoon knew none of these command-level debates, knew only that the tactic worked, that it saved their lives, that it let them accomplish missions that had seemed suicidal using conventional approaches, and they adopted it completely, requested more white phosphorus grenades through supply channels that were confused about why frontline units suddenly needed smoke grenades in quantities that exceeded any reasonable signaling requirement, and by the time official prohibition orders were drafted and transmitted, the tactical situation had already shifted, the critical bunker complexes were already cleared, and the Biak Island campaign was transitioning from desperate assault to mopping up operations, and the question of whether to court-martial Moon for violating standing orders became moot because doing so would require acknowledging that command had lost control of tactics on the ground, would require explaining why an unauthorized technique had succeeded where authorized methods had failed, would require officials to admit that sometimes junior enlisted men understand battlefield realities better than senior officers understand doctrine. Moon was never officially reprimanded, never officially commended, existed in bureaucratic limbo where his personnel file contained contradictory information. Exemplary conduct in combat, possible unauthorized weapons use, recommended for consideration but no specific award proposed. And he finished the war as he'd started it, as a private who'd done what seemed necessary in the moment and then moved on to the next objective. And when he returned to Iowa after Japan's surrender, he told no one about Biak Island, didn't discuss the bunkers or the white phosphorus or the choices he'd made, simply returned to farming and to a life where problems were different but the same pragmatic mindset applied. You assessed situations honestly, you used available tools creatively, you did what worked rather than what you'd been told should work, and you accepted that sometimes the right answer violated the official answer. The military's response to Moon's innovation was characteristically contradictory. White phosphorus use against bunkers was quietly incorporated into tactical training for Pacific operations, passed along through informal channels and lessons learned briefings that never quite became official doctrine, adopted by units that faced similar defensive positions but never endorsed by command structures that remained uncomfortable with the weapon's effects and the ethical questions it raised. And this parallel doctrine, the one that existed in practice while being denied in policy, spread through the Pacific theater as veterans who'd seen it work taught replacements who needed to survive similar situations, and by war's end, white phosphorus was being used offensively throughout the Pacific despite standing orders that technically prohibited such use, and no one was court-martialed and no doctrine was officially changed, and the contradiction simply existed because war accommodates contradictions better than peacetime militaries acknowledge. Historical accounts of the Biak Island campaign mention the tactical innovation of bunker clearing techniques but rarely name Moon, rarely credit the farm boy from Iowa who broke rules and saved lives, and this erasure wasn't malicious but systematic. Official histories are written by officers who prefer to credit doctrine and training rather than acknowledge that junior enlisted men sometimes have better tactical sense. Military institutions are uncomfortable with success stories that involve violating regulations, and the narrative of American victory works better when it emphasizes superior training and equipment rather than desperate improvisation by soldiers who disregarded orders because orders weren't working. Moon's name appears in a few after-action reports, in intelligence summaries that were classified for decades, in personal accounts from men who served with him, but not in the textbooks or documentaries that shaped public understanding of the Pacific War, and this absence is itself instructive about what gets remembered and what gets forgotten, about which stories fit comfortable narratives and which stories complicate them, about the difference between history as recorded by institutions and history as experienced by individuals who were there. Years after the war, a military historian researching bunker tactics in the Pacific located Moon, still farming in Iowa, still quiet, still uncomfortable with attention, and asked him about Biak Island, about the decision to use white phosphorus offensively, about whether he'd understood the implications of violating standing orders, and Moon's response was characteristically pragmatic. I saw men dying because what we were doing wasn't working. I saw something that might work. I tried it. It worked. I don't know what else you want me to say. When pressed about the ethical implications, about the effects of white phosphorus on human bodies, about whether he'd struggled with the decision, Moon was quiet for a long time before responding. War is about killing people until they stop fighting back. We can pretend some ways of killing are more acceptable than others, but I was trying to get my people home alive, and I did what seemed likely to accomplish that. If that makes me a war criminal, then I guess I'm a war criminal, but those 700 men who didn't die because bunkers got cleared faster, they got to go home too, and their families got to see them again, and that's what I think about when I think about Biak. The historian noted that Moon never used the word hero, and seemed actively uncomfortable with any suggestion that his actions were particularly courageous or innovative. Insisted instead that he'd simply done what needed doing with tools that were available. And when asked if he had regrets, Moon said only, "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that the war happened at all. I regret a lot of things. But I don't regret trying to keep my people alive." The legacy of Moon's innovation on Biak Island extends beyond tactics and doctrine, extends into questions about military culture and institutional learning, about the gap between what regulations prescribe and what combat requires, about the role of individual initiative in organizations that value obedience. And these questions remain relevant because modern militaries still struggle with the tension between standardized procedures and battlefield adaptation, still face situations where junior personnel see solutions that senior leadership doesn't, still must decide whether to punish violations that achieve objectives or celebrate results regardless of methods. Moon's story demonstrates that warfare rewards problem-solving more than rule-following, that survival often depends on seeing beyond official purposes to actual capabilities, that the most effective innovations sometimes come from unlikely sources, from farm boys who understand fire and tools and pragmatic assessment of what works, from soldiers who care more about accomplishing missions and protecting their units than about career advancement or avoiding controversy, from individuals who make decisions in moments of crisis based on immediate tactical reality rather than distant policy considerations. The fact that Moon's name rarely appears in historical accounts, that his innovation was adopted without being acknowledged, that he received neither punishment nor significant recognition, suggests that military institutions are more comfortable with anonymous effectiveness than with credited rule-breaking, prefer outcomes that can be attributed to doctrine rather than individuals who exceeded. Doctrine, and this preference shapes what stories get told and what lessons get learned, shapes understanding of how wars are actually fought versus how institutions claim they should be fought. Biak Island today is quiet. The bunkers that Moon cleared have been reclaimed by jungle. The coral ridges where American soldiers died show no signs of the battles fought there. And there is no monument to Private Harold Moon, no marker indicating where he made decisions that changed the campaign's outcome, no official recognition of the farm boy who looked at a forbidden weapon and saw a solution, and this absence is perhaps appropriate because Moon never sought recognition, never claimed to be anything more than a soldier doing what seemed necessary, and the 700 men who survived because bunkers were cleared faster than conventional tactics allowed have mostly died now, have taken their memories of Biak Island and white phosphorus and desperate fights in coral caves to graves across America, and with them dies the direct memory of how Moon's innovation felt to those it saved, how it looked to watch someone deliberately violate orders because following orders meant watching friends die, how it changed the calculation of survival on an island where every tactical advantage mattered. History remembers generals who planned campaigns and admirals who commanded fleets, remembers MacArthur's return to the Philippines and Nimitz's island-hopping strategy, remembers the big picture and the strategic decisions, but the battlefield remembers differently, remembers the private from Iowa who threw a grenade he wasn't supposed to throw and cleared a bunker that couldn't be cleared and started a tactical cascade that saved hundreds of lives, remembers that sometimes wars are won not by following doctrine but by individuals who understand that rules exist to achieve objectives, and when rules prevent achieving objectives the rules become obstacles rather than guidelines, and this battlefield memory, preserved in scattered after-action reports and aging veteran stories and military lessons learned that were never officially acknowledged, preserves a truth that institutions find uncomfortable, that victory often depends on people willing to exceed their authority, violate their orders, and take responsibility for making decisions that their superiors won't make, and Private Harold Moon, who returned to Iowa and farmed until his death in 1987, who never sought recognition and rarely discussed the war, who remained uncomfortable with any suggestion that his actions were heroic rather than simply necessary, embodies this uncomfortable truth, demonstrates that warfare's actual practitioners often understand tactical reality better than warfare's official managers, and proves that sometimes the most important military innovations come not from staff colleges or weapons laboratories but from ordinary soldiers who see problems clearly, assess available tools honestly, and make decisions based on what works rather than what's authorized. And the fact that this story remains largely untold, that Moon's name appears rarely in histories of the Pacific War, that his innovation was adopted while being officially denied, suggests that military institutions and historical narratives prefer comfortable myths about doctrine and training to uncomfortable truths about improvisation and rule-breaking, prefer to believe that victory comes from superior organization rather than acknowledge that it often comes from individuals who disregard organization when organization fails, and in this preference we see the gap between how wars are remembered and how wars are fought, between the history that gets written in books and the history that gets written in blood. On islands like Biak, where ordinary men make extraordinary decisions and then go home and never speak of them again because they don't think of themselves as extraordinary, don't think of rule-breaking as heroism, think only that they did what needed doing with what they had available, and if that's not the story we want to tell about American victory in the Pacific, if that's not the narrative that fits comfortable assumptions about military excellence and superior training, then perhaps the problem isn't with the story but with our assumptions about how wars are actually won and who actually wins them.